An urgent decision on the war. Zelensky's trump cards have actually worked. This is what the Kremlin feared the most. Ukraine has agreed to change the rules of the game. Trump gave a signal that even the Europeans didn't expect. Peace for Ukraine and a new news for Russia. A real sensation. Fedorov has come out with an urgent statement. The front has changed. The armed forces launched a phenomenal process right on the front line. The Russian army has begun preparing for surrender. Ukrainian ballistics will finally dot all the I's. You won't believe it. The Kremlin has actually started selling its own territories. Putin fell for the wallet, and all this happened right now. Greetings. I'm Daryna Gutsalo, and we're starting. The Kremlin is starting to get even more nervous. The West has done the simply impossible for Kyiv. G7 leaders officially agreed on a package of decisions that significantly strengthens Ukraine's capabilities both in defending its own skies and in hitting targets far in the Russian rear. Additional air defense systems and interceptor missiles, new capabilities for long-range strikes, and more. Now a new reality.
We are also ready to consider the possibility of providing Ukraine with appropriate licenses to help increase the volume of military production in Ukraine.
And that's not all. In parallel, the West is preparing a new blow to Russian revenues. Oil and gas, which still remain the Kremlin's main financial pillar, are coming under sanctions pressure. It seems that for Moscow, bad news continues to arrive from several directions at once. Donald Trump personally decided to strike a blow of force against the Russian Federation. The US president stated that Washington is ready to return tough restrictions against the Russian oil sector in case of further escalation by the Kremlin. In Europe, this gesture was assessed as fateful.
And I saw that he is very inclined to cooperate, and I also saw how carefully he listens. And in this regard, again, it gives me some optimism that we here, as Europeans and as Americans, are now doing everything possible together to put an end to the war.
The Kremlin received another unpleasant signal from the West. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated that there is complete unity among the leaders. Sanctions against the Russian Federation are working, and Ukraine continues to demonstrate results on the battlefield. Moreover, the West believes that now is the time not to loosen, but on the contrary, to tighten the screws on Moscow even more. So to be continued. It's actually hard to believe. The decisive 6 months have started. Ukraine's defense forces are launching a deadly machine for the enemy right on the front line. The battlefield is finally preparing to pass under the control of the armed forces. Ukraine's defense minister Fedorov spoke about this in an interview with TSN.
In fact, we are forming a different battlefield because other supplies are increasing, the quality of drones, and a different reality is being formed on the battlefield. Right now, well, for the next 6 months, we'll definitely have the advantage.
According to him, as it gets harder to show results on the battlefield, Putin is returning to his usual tactic of missile terror against Ukrainian cities. At the same time, the official emphasized these attacks don't change the situation at the front, don't stop the production of Ukrainian weapons, and only show how nervously the Kremlin reacts to its own problems. So, despite everything, Ukrainian ballistics are here to stay.
Ukrainian ballistics will change everything in this war. It will change Ukraine's status in the world altogether. We've already changed it many times. This is a whole different league. Ukrainian ballistics will exist and they will strike Russia.
It seems the Kremlin has received another wake-up call. What will happen next? We're following the developments. This moment has finally arrived. In the RF, it seems they're increasingly making forced concessions that are already hard to hide behind loud propaganda. According to Reuters, Russia is effectively entering a format of a hidden sell-off of its resources and assets. And this time, it's no longer within the usual circle of allies.
The Indian mining company IREL is in talks with Rosneft regarding the supply of rare earth samples from Tomtor, a Siberian deposit acquired by the Russian oil producer last year. As New Delhi seeks to secure supplies of critical minerals dominated by China, a source said.
It has become known that the negotiation process is taking place at the level of government structures, and samples will undergo primary processing in Russia before being sent to India. Note that the Tomtor deposit is located in the Siberian region of Yakutia and is considered one of the world's largest undeveloped sources of rare earth metals. It seems Putin, despite gritting his teeth, is ready to share what's his with allies out of desperation. What piece of Russian land will he be ready to give away next? It's a mystery for now. However, we're keeping our finger on the pulse. The Kremlin is nervously reviewing the scenario for the future. What was called stability until recently now resembles a system working at the limit of its capabilities. Russia is on the brink. Deputies have openly spoken about corruption, the risk of mass unrest, and growing public discontent. A coup is literally breathing down the dictator's neck. You won't believe it. Ours managed something shocking. The Russian economy has collapsed. Problems have covered Moscow like a shroud. Now it's official. Putin has lost control of the situation. Is it really time to sign the surrender? Let's watch.
Putin is already one step away from collapse. The smell of crisis is growing stronger in the Kremlin. And this time, it's not the opposition sounding the alarm. Even in the Russian State Duma, it's getting harder to hide the nervousness. CPRF Deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion.
According to him, the time for illusions is over and the responsibility for potential chaos will fall entirely on the current government. For a system where officials have competed in loyalty to Putin for years, such statements sound like a rather alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another deputy joined the critics, communist Rinat Suleimanov, who had previously called for the war to end as quickly as possible. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, an uncomfortable question is being asked more and more often. How much longer can Russia endure this war? Reasons for dissatisfaction are piling up one after another. Mass internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are hitting public morale harder and harder. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to speak openly about the dangerous social pressure building up behind the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence data on the internal situation in Russia came as a total shock to Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained documents on the actual internal political state of Russia, the very same reports that land directly on Putin's desk. And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite bleak.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without sugarcoating. But even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually sagging. And this creates a rather awkward dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why everything is getting worse, or once again demonstrate miracles of electoral mathematics. Equally alarming for Moscow is the rise in protest sentiment in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when accumulated dissatisfaction might break through, especially considering that summer is still ahead with its economic problems, strikes on logistics, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports also do not account for potential events in June, July, and August, which cannot fail to further impact the situation in Russia.
And this is where the most interesting part begins. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to continue increasing pressure on Russia, military, economic, and diplomatic. This means that for the Kremlin, the most difficult months may still be ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems accumulate, ratings fall, and drones strike, even the strongest propaganda starts to malfunction.
The entirely justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and will only continue to increase. And not just our pressure. So by September, Putin will emerge with even significantly worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's steadfastness, Ukraine increasingly demonstrates a completely different image of the Kremlin, which is losing control over events and is forced to constantly extinguish new crises. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of failures. Fuel problems in a country that for decades took pride in its status as an energy superpower, strikes on logistics, attacks on strategic objects, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin still talks about its strength but spends more and more time not on the offensive but on eliminating the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not only on destroying individual targets but on maintaining such a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply doesn't have time to adapt to. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion lasts, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more. That is why, on the eve of the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and a new package of sanctions, Kyiv is actively promoting a simple message for Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who can win than in someone who tries to explain their problems with yet more propaganda tales. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that problems are accumulating simultaneously from several sides. A new EU sanctions package, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes. If until recently the Kremlin sold the world the image of an invulnerable fortress, today this image increasingly resembles the facade of a building where cracks are visible even from afar. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse. A real sensation. Our people were finally able to take revenge on Putin. Crimea is losing its connection with Russia. Russians are cursing the peninsula. It's a real trap there. Emergency evacuation is just around the corner. People are almost fighting at gas stations and store shelves are empty. All bridges are being cut off for the Kremlin. The Crimean crossing is turning into a dead zone. The mechanism for the deoccupation of Crimea has now been officially launched. What is happening right now, and why is the situation becoming increasingly alarming for the man in the bunker? Don't miss the shocking details in just a moment. Magyar's birds are liberating Crimea. The commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Robert Brovdy, stated that Ukraine intends to isolate the occupied peninsula from Russia and gradually take full control of key supply routes. According to him, a series of strikes on the so-called Novorossiya highway, which connects the Rostov region with Crimea through the occupied territories of Ukraine, has already yielded tangible results. In the last month alone, traffic intensity there has decreased by more than 2/3. What Kremlin propaganda called a reliable land corridor just yesterday is increasingly looking like a high-risk route where every trip could be the last for equipment or cargo. Magyar compared Ukrainian drone strikes on transport in open road sections to hunting partridges in an open field. And in this satirical metaphor, there is little to laugh about for Russian logistics. Convoys that moved freely to Crimea for years are now increasingly forced to look not at road signs but at the sky. The main goal, according to the commander, is not just the destruction of equipment. Ukraine aims to create conditions where staying in occupied Crimea and using the routes to it becomes too dangerous and an expensive luxury. If these plans are realized, the peninsula, which the Kremlin presented for years as a symbol of its victory, risks turning into a military enclave cut off from main resources, where each new day will bring more questions and fewer answers. Crimean logistics are bursting at the seams, and the occupiers trying to bypass one set of ruins drive into new ones every time. After the defense forces' strikes on the Chonhar Bridge, the Russian command hastily diverted streams of equipment through Armyansk. But it seems the Ukrainian military was already waiting for this maneuver. According to Dmytro Filatov, commander of the 1st Separate Assault Regiment named after Dmytro Kotsiubailo, the Chonhar Bridge sustained critical damage and now requires large-scale restoration. Traffic on it is effectively stopped. Neither trucks nor passenger cars use it anymore. The occupiers are trying to save the situation with pontoon crossings and new routes, but every such plan B turns into another problem. The most painful blow the Russians received was precisely near Armyansk. After blocking Chonhar, the enemy concentrated a large convoy of trucks with fuel and ammunition there. As Filatov reported, the Ukrainian military struck this target, resulting in a convoy of as many as 50 vehicles being hit. Some of the trucks were destroyed along with critically important cargo.
We carried out another action. We'll tell you later how it went. Because the Chonhar Bridge was damaged, the enemy concentrated a large number of trucks with military cargo moving specifically through Armyansk. Accordingly, during the strike, we managed to hit trucks carrying fuel and ammunition. There were about 50 vehicles there, and some of them were destroyed.
It is particularly telling that the decision to strike the Chonhar Bridge was made after receiving information about the transfer of fuel for Russian troops across it. Only 6 hours passed from the decision to the execution of the operation, and the Ukrainian military calculated the route through Armyansk in advance, understanding that after the strike on Chonhar, the occupiers would look for bypass routes. As a result, Russian commanders are now forced to think not about offensive plans, but about how to deliver fuel and ammunition to the front line at all. According to Filatov, such strikes provide not only an immediate effect, but also create long-term problems, forcing Russia to spend huge resources on restoring bridges, crossings, and logistics routes. The commander himself emphasized that this success was made possible by systematic pressure on all occupation logistics. Strikes on Mariupol and the Berdyansk highway forced the Russians to reroute supplies through Crimea. And when the cargo flows change direction, Ukrainian forces quickly cut off this route as well.
We realized this, blocked these routes for them quite quickly, and continue to weaken the enemy further. And if this trend continues, the occupiers' main problem soon may not be a Ukrainian offensive, but a simple question: how to get at least fuel and shells to their troops.
It seems the operation to liberate Crimea began long ago, and it's happening not through loud statements, but by systematically destroying everything keeping the occupation afloat. Bridges are collapsing, fuel and ammo convoys are burning, and logistic arteries are falling under the control of Ukrainian drones one by one. For years, the Kremlin convinced the world that Crimea was forever tied to Russia, but today that tie is breaking right before our eyes. And the more the occupiers look for bypass routes, the more obvious a simple truth becomes: an isolated Crimea is no longer a future scenario, but a process that is happening right now. And when the enemy loses roads, supplies, and the ability to move safely, the issue of deoccupation stops being a dream and gradually becomes a matter of time. Putin has finally played himself. China's favor toward the Russian Federation has suddenly turned into unceremonious contempt for Moscow. Beijing is gradually increasing its influence, getting favorable terms, and effectively dictating its own rules, where Russia recently tried to look like an equal partner. It seems the geopolitical chessboard is changing before our eyes. Xi Jinping is taking entire regions away from Putin. The friendship has indeed ended. Be the first to know. China is devouring Russia. Quietly, without unnecessary words. Xi Jinping is taking territories, and Putin gladly gives them up and bows at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw material appendage with a long Chinese contract. A prime example is the Zashulanskoye coal field in Transbaikalia, developed jointly by Russia's N+ Group and China's Shenhua Group. The project is designed for a century of extraction, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In effect, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, with Beijing as the main beneficiary. Starting in 2027, they plan to ship about 5 million tons of coal to China from here annually. That's hundreds of trucks every day. New routes are being laid literally through forests near mineral water springs and nature conservation zones. Ecology, it seems, acts as a secondary detail in this system that simply wasn't included in the business plan. Parallel to resources, China is actively entering the region through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourism infrastructure is growing to cater to Chinese visitors. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, squeezing out local entrepreneurs. According to various estimates, there could already be up to 2 million Chinese citizens in the Far East. And against this backdrop, it looks less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reformatting of the region for Beijing's interests. And while Russia is gradually turning into a resource periphery for China, even harsher scenarios are appearing in the Chinese information space. It's no longer about cooperation, but the actual division of Russian territories in a crisis. And surprisingly, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. A report in Chinese media directly discusses potential control over 7 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East in the event of Russia's internal collapse. The authors point out that due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have moved west, leaving eastern regions virtually empty, with minimal military presence and weak territorial control. The economic conclusion sounds even harsher. Russia, the authors estimate, is rapidly degrading, and its economy is allegedly smaller than a single Chinese province. And here, cold logic comes into play. If Russia's center weakens, the Far East and its resources must not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation around Crimea. Instead, another approach is proposed: soft absorption through investment, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region that formally remain independent but effectively become dependent on China. In fact, the text conveys the main point without sugarcoating it. Russia no longer seems capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, seizing the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analysis, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public space looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of a post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can we move forward with confidence.
Or perhaps the Middle Kingdom won't wait for Russia's collapse, but will speak the language of force. China is building a giant military mega-complex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already saying they've never seen anything like it. It's a new strategic zone near intercontinental nuclear missile silos where, according to Reuters, over 80 launch pads, bunkers, a rail hub, airfields, and command centers are being built. Essentially, a full-scale military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 giant octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest they could house electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems. But the key detail is that no one knows exactly what's inside. And it's this uncertainty that scares analysts the most. In fact, this is an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture amid escalating tensions with the US, especially over Taiwan. What's rising in the desert isn't just a military base, but a new level of strategic reality where Beijing shows its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to grasp the scale of what's been seen, experts admit they've never recorded such a level of military construction in the era of nuclear states. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia looks less and less like an independent power center and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. China is not acting abruptly, for right now, but it seems Putin might see the day when Xi Jinping takes what is his quite suddenly and without any warning. That brings us to the end of this episode. We are continuing on right now. We are tracking the most current events so that we can be the ones to bring them to you first. Do not forget to subscribe. We will see you